Welcome and thank you for joining the Q&A for MLK FBI. I'm Gwen Diglis, Deputy Director for the American Cinematheque, and I'd like to invite you to visit our website, americancinematheque.com, for information about our upcoming program and how you can support the American Cinematheque by making a donation and becoming a member. I'd like to thank IFC Film for this Q&A with filmmaker Sam Pollard, and leading the conversation is actor David Oyelowo. Thank you and enjoy.
Hi, Sam.
Hey, David, how are you doing this evening? Thanks for doing this.
Oh, my pleasure. My absolute pleasure. Congratulations on a fantastic film.
Thank you very much.
Truly, truly compelling. Yeah, as you know, I have my own relationship with Dr. King and this material, having played him. And so, one of the first questions I wanted to ask you is actually one that you asked David Garrow in your documentary, which is, what do you think your responsibility as a documentarian is to Dr. King, considering the depiction of him is incisive, but it's also indicative of him as a flawed man. That was definitely something I was very mindful of when I was playing him. So what did you feel your responsibility was to him and to the truth as you were making this documentary?
That's a great question, David. I was 18 years old when Dr. King was assassinated on April 4th, 1968. And back then, in many African-American households, there were three pictures on the wall when you went to their living rooms. There was Martin Luther King Jr., John F. Kennedy, and Jesus Christ. So when I was 17, 18, 16, 17, 18, I had tremendous reverence for Dr. King. But as I've grown as a filmmaker, as a documentary filmmaker, and I'm digging into people's past and their lives, I feel that my responsibility is to still make sure that you see them as the heroes that they are, but that they're also human beings, that they don't walk on water. And to me, I felt the responsibility with my producer, Benedine, was in painting this portrait of Dr. King. I wanted to make sure you see the ascendancy of what he was doing from the 50s through the 60s with the civil rights struggle, but the burdens he had to confront and deal with, both his own personal issues and both understanding that he was constantly being surveilled and monitored by the FBI. And so I felt if we could do that, but do it in a responsible way, not do it as a gotcha moment, that we were doing our job. So, I was just trying to make sure that you understand all the different facets of Dr. King, a man who, out of nowhere in 1955, 56, became the head of the Montgomery bus boycott, a man who started an organization with others, the SCLC, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, a man who, as A. Philip Randolph says at the beginning of the film, is the moral leader of this movement, a man who knew that he was constantly being wiretapped and monitored by Hoover and the FBI, a man who understood his own, failings as a husband and a father, but also a man who was also trying to keep this movement afloat, a man who by 1967, David, when he did his speech at Riverside Church, knew that when he came out against the war in Vietnam, he was going to destroy the relationship he had with the Johnson administration. So all of these things he was dealing with, as he was trying to get the Poor People's Campaign off. And then he was asked to come to Memphis to help that sanitation strike. You could see as this film, as the documentary unfolds, the burden that Dr. King had to was constantly on his shoulder. And that's what I felt I was trying to put across in this film.
Yeah, I mean, you did it brilliantly. It's definitely something that we were very mindful of when we were making Selma as well. Everything it's really sort of bringing back that experience for me, everything you're saying, because that was certainly the burden we felt, is to not deny the transcendency of what he did whilst not hiding the fact that he was indeed a human being. When I watched the film, one of the things that really hits me is that it very succinctly displays the contradictions on which America and American life and politics are built. This notion of freedom, and yet the justification of denying people freedom to the point of illegally bugging Dr. King. I mean, you know, that's one of the things that the doc really illustrates, is that this was illegal activity. You in your doc, you have J. Edgar Hoover on record saying we only have 90 or so wiretaps out there, and they are for very, very specific reasons. And those specific reasons he states are not the reasons for which they were bugging Dr. King. So talk to me about why you think America is built on this sort of these layers of contradictions.
Well, you know, America says it's a land of the land of the free and the home of the brave. But as we know from his history, that there's this hypocrisy in America. The notion that America is the land of free and home of the brave has always been very hypocritical. So think about this. After 1896, the Plessy versus Ferguson, when segregation is really codified, Black people, you know, in communities all around the country could not go into bathrooms, could not sit on the front of the bus, you know, could not sit in restaurants, you know. But America in the 50s thought white America thought everything was fine. Yeah. All of a sudden, here comes a Black man who basically says, we no longer want to be second-class citizens. We want to be equal. We want to be able to sit at the front of the bus. We don't want to have to use the colored bathroom. We don't have to. We don't have to sit up in the balcony in the movie theaters. We don't want to have to sit on the. And we don't want to have to be able not to sit in the restaurant. So all of a sudden, someone like J. Edgar Hoover, who we should remember, is really speaking for the majority of white Americans. He's not an outlier. He's basically talking for America. Basically, America is saying, why are you Black people causing all this ruckus? Aren't you happy? Aren't you happy sitting in the back of the bus? Aren't you happy not being able to go to a restaurant? Aren't you happy not being able to try on clothes? What's the problem? And the other issue with Hoover, when you really look at it, is the obsession with African-American men, that all of a sudden, that if you empower them, they're going to take over our lives. They're going to sexualize our white women. You know, it's in the American DNA. And what's fascinating about this film, David, is that I think it's a mirror into America today. So for example, when the lady on the talk show asked Dr. King, don't you think your peaceful protests are causing the riots in the cities? I just heard I heard a congressman today say the same thing. The protests, the Black Power, the Black Lives Movement is causing these riots in the cities. And then when someone says back in that film, communism, Dr. King is associating with, you know, Stanley Levinson, communism, he's going to betray American democracy. When Trump was running for president in 2020, David, when he was on the stump, all you heard was, if you elect these socialist Democrats, they're going to go into our suburbs. They're going to destroy America. So to me, this film is a mirror reflecting how America, in some ways, as we know, has made some big leaps and bounds, but in some ways, they're still as backwards as they were in the 1950s and 1960s.
Yeah, that lady that you just mentioned there, I remember the other question she asked him is, don't you think you guys are trying to move too fast? You know, and you have somewhere else where at the point in which Dr. King is being interviewed, he said there was 244 years of slavery.
That's right. That's right.
The willful ignorance, I don't even know if it's ignorance, but just the willfulness laced into that question. I mean, I really admired Dr. King's patience to actually answer
extremely that. Patient. But it, you know, it goes back to as I was saying to you before we started this. I rewatched Selma, and the scene when Dr. King goes into Selma and he goes into the hotel, and all the white people are looking at him, and the guy says, "Dr. King." And he walks over to Dr. King. Dr. King extends his hand and he slaps Dr. King. The patience of Dr. King, man, not to, you know, fight back. I part of me said, Dr. King, you should strike this man back. But the other part understood his philosophy, you know, the fact that nonviolent activism was going to be important in making this movement move forward. You know, amazing.
Let's talk about that for a second, Sam, because there's also a moment where there's this lady, this white lady in the doc is asked a question as to what she thinks of Dr. King, and she says, essentially, I don't like him. He thinks he's too smart.
That's right.
Which is such an odd statement. He thinks he's too smart. What does that mean? He thinks he's more intelligent than he is, or he should be, or it's just such a loaded comment. My question to you is, why do you think Dr. King specifically was so triggering for Hoover and America at this time? Because you just said there yourself that Hoover was not an outlier. He was actually reflective of the time. He was reflective of a notion of what America should be, a protection of what America should stay. And clearly Dr. King in some way was triggering to him. There's that phrase, I think it's after the Civil Rights Act is passed. No, it's not that. It's the March on Washington, where they then deem him to be the most dangerous figure for America's future. What was it? What was it about him? What did he signify that was so triggering for Hoover and America at that time?
He signified dignity, intelligence, and articulation. And America's perception of Black people, and specifically Black men, because they've been culturalized to think of Black men as Step and Fetch It, Willie Best, Mantan Moreland, Butterfly McQueen, Hattie McDaniels. And who are these Black people? How did we see them in the cinema? They were scared of their shadows. They'd run away from any kind of threat. They didn't stand up for themselves. They were weak. They didn't have any power. They weren't emboldened by anything. And that's how many white people saw Black people. They were, the porters at the train station. They were the shoe shine people. They didn't have any sort of sense of, well, these people have power and they have power and they can be emboldened. So all of a sudden, for a man like Dr. King to stand up there at the Lincoln Memorial and say, I have a dream, and to have people so excited and have a large congregation of people, it had to scare the bejesus out of J. Edgar Hoover and many white people. It just scared them to death. All of a sudden, America, in some ways, David, when you think about what happened on January 6th, that's sort of the same symptoms that America. The systemic racism that's based on the founding of this country, many white Americans still hold to their breast. The idea, David, that America might no longer be for white people is frightening. It's frightening, and it never really was, but we were always in the shadows. People of color were always in the shadows. Now that we're coming front and center, they're scared to death. And the election of Barack Obama in 2008, turned the light on to people who said, oh my God, America will no longer be white. Because I grew up in America, David, in the 60s, where all I saw when I turned on my TV was pretty much white people. When I watched the old movies, it wasn't Sidney Poitier initially, Harry Belafonte. It was Kirk Douglas and Burt Lancaster and John Wayne. It wasn't Dorothy Dandridge or Cicely Tyson. It was Barbara Stanwyck and Joan Crawford. So there was a mythology built about America, that was white people. It was a white world, and it's changed.
Yeah, well, and that's a point that I think the documentary makes brilliantly well. You talk about how, in many ways, the FBI was canonized by movies at the time. This heroic portrayal of the G-Man and things like that. And so you could see the mythology of the FBI as cultivated by Hoover and his cohorts, and how that was affecting culture. It's really interesting because even in 2000, end of 2014, 2015, when Selma was coming out, it was a conversation we kept on having, even with the release of the film, because you know, I've held this view, and I think, as you say yourself, you know, things have been changing, but you've seen that in cinema. You know, we have tended to, in Hollywood, celebrate, you mentioned Hattie McDaniel, films in which Black people are subjugated, subservient, criminalized. You know, those have tended to be historically the films for which we get accolades and win awards. And
Right.
then when we are playing characters who are inspired, inspiring, and aspirational, suddenly we are lambasted with accusations of them being false portrayals, historically
That's
inaccurate.
right. That's
Anything
exactly right.
to undermine them and marginalize them, something we definitely experienced with Selma as well. And I know a number of films that have suffered that fate, but if we were playing slaves, it would not be quite the same vitriol. For you, making a film like this, which will, yes, contextualize Dr. King, absolutely shine a light on some of the very shady things that the FBI were doing, but is also going to be a precursor to, in 2027, when these documents are going to be unsealed. And in many ways, your documentary now becomes an appetizer to that moment. It's the announcement of that moment. I didn't know that we are that close to those being unveiled, and who knows what's in them. But considering this information was acquired through nefarious, insidious means, and we do not know what these documents are going to do to the legacy of Dr. King, did that give you any sense of conflict in terms of, like I say, being a door through which people will now be anticipating those documents being unsealed?
Well, you know, we asked ourselves the same question, myself and Ben Hadeen. Were we doing exactly what the FBI had been trying to do in all those years ago? Were we going to turn, you know, destroy Dr. King's reputation with this film? I mean, we asked ourselves that question time and time and time again. I mean, even when we had to deal with the rape allegation, you know, we felt like maybe we shouldn't put it in, but then we knew if we didn't put it in, that someone would say, well, you guys, you know, you tried to do hagiography on Dr. King. So it's a complicated question for us that we, you know, we just felt that if we could be responsible, we could do it in a way that wouldn't maybe raise too many hackles. Now, the question about 2027 brings up to me a couple of interesting observations. Observation one, in 2027, when the FBI, if the tapes are released, my first question, David, is will they be unedited tapes? Because if they're unedited tapes, then we will hear more than just, you know, the salation stuff of Dr. King. We'll hear conversations that may existed between him and Fred Shuttlesworth or Andy Young or even John Lewis about the strategies they were going to take place in these particular cities, like in Selma. If the tapes are edited, then it'll probably be just the salation stuff. Then part of me says they shouldn't be released. So I think it'll take someone to really sort of investigate and dig into what's on those tapes before they're actually released, you know, to make sure that if they release the unedited tapes, and I'm open to seeing it, listening to them. And the other thing that probably I hadn't considered this before we finish this film, but maybe we will have to do, you know, an addendum to this film, you know, a 30-minute, part two to look at what happens after these tapes are released. Right.
Well, you know, while we're having our conversation, which I'm loving, I'm just going to throw in a couple of, you know, some of the folks that are throwing in questions, which I'm sneaking a look at, and some of them are quite interesting. There's one here that says, I'm curious to both of you and Sam. So it's saying, why do you think Martin Luther King has been de-radicalized by many people in society? It makes me sick to my stomach to see these Republicans paying tribute to him every year when King was such an outspoken critic against militarism and capitalism, as well as loathed by the white establishment. I'm not sure MLK would be welcomed by such voices today. I think it's a good point, because you make the point in the doc. There's even a moment where people who are canvassed, I think Hoover's approval rating was around 50%, Dr. King's about 17%. Oh, it's more than that. But the point being, Dr. King was very much
Unpopular.
the villain, the one who was loathed by society. And then later on in your doc, you illustrate that, you know, leaders of the NAACP and elsewhere were against him as well, especially when he started talking out against Vietnam and speaking up for poor whites as well. So, you know, it's a good point that was just made there. What's your feeling about how Dr. King has been sanitized in some ways compared to how we see him in your film?
Because you know what happens with people, David? Amnesia sets in. Amnesia. All of a sudden now we're 40 years away from this. And the only thing they can remember now is the I Have a Dream speech. I mean, it's the same thing as looking at Muhammad Ali. Muhammad Ali in his last 10, 15 years became an icon to Americans. White Americans see him on the street, oh, we love you, Ali. We love you, Ali. But if you go back to 1964, 65, when Ali refused to go into the service, you know, and he changed his name from Cassius Clay to Ali, people said, why is he doing that? You know, how come he's with the Nation of Islam? How dare he not serve in the army? You know, they stripped him of his belt. He was a pariah. But 20, 30 years later, amnesia sets in. Now he's the great Muhammad Ali. Now Dr. King is the great man. People forget that the history of someone has, you know, it was very different way back when they were alive. But now it becomes sort of sanitized and changed. And that's what's happened with this country. All of a sudden they forget that he was a radical. You know, they think now, oh, they have all these statues, all these streets named after him, these schools named after him. He's a great man. You know, it's hypocrisy again, American hypocrisy.
Do you think that that's partly what we're dealing with in American history generally, in terms of, you know, Hoover is talking about some sort of idealized notion of what America is. That lady who asked him if Black people are asking for things to change too quickly clearly was completely ignoring how disgusting slavery was and had been for people. There's sort of this selective memory of what America is. And so that's why a phrase like "Make America Great Again" can stick, because there is, like I say, a selective collective memory of what America is. How much of that do you think plays into the legacy of what America actually is, as opposed to what it says it is?
Well, for people of color, it doesn't play.
Right.
We all understand the legacy of America. But there are groups of white people who have this notion that, oh, sure, there was slavery, but that was in the past. You know, it has nothing to do with us today. You know, the idea that there was, you know, they were enslaved for 250 years doesn't mean anything. The idea that we had segregation, Jim Crowism, you know, American apartheid for 50 years doesn't mean anything. America's changed. People never take responsibility for the past. And if you understand your past, you won't repeat the present. And that's what many Americans still do. They say, well, that had nothing to do. My ancestors didn't enslave you, you know, they didn't beat you, they didn't lynch you. No, but it was white people, you know, and the attitude of that we saw back after the American Revolution, up to the Civil War, and after the Civil War, still takes place. The idea, David, that these people, these marauders who went into the Capitol building on January 6th, the idea that they would put up a rope to lynch Mike Pence speaks volumes to the history of America, speaks volumes to the past, that people say, well, we forgot about that. It's still there, front and center.
The thing, you know, I agree with you But I will say that one of the shocking things I found as I traveled America during the release of Selma is how little of the history people
People
actually
know.
knew. And I'm talking about Black people. I
Yeah.
remember asking, I remember asking a kid, a Black kid, who Dr. King was. And he said, oh, didn't he free the slaves? Was his answer.
Jesus.
Uh, um, we screened Selma in Selma, Alabama, at a church hall, and at the end of the screening, a white lady at the back put her hand up. We were doing a Q&A, and she said, "Thank you so much for this film." Because, and we're talking about Selma, Alabama, which is a tiny town, tiny
Oh
town.
yeah. Yeah.
And she said, and this was in 2015, so only 50 years after the events charted in Selma, she said, "Thank you for this film because I didn't know that that happened here."
Oh,
And she had lived in Selma her whole life. And we were
really?
literally spitting distance from the Edmund Pettus Bridge. I kid you not. You know, people from Selma, Alabama didn't know that Edmund Pettus, the Edmund Pettus Bridge, the famous bridge over which Dr. King marched from Selma to Montgomery, was named after the Grand Dragon of the Ku Klux Klan.
Klux Klan. Exactly.
So the point being that yes, it doesn't play for Black people in America, but the specifics of the history have become hazy because of what I hesitate to call dominant culture. You know, and I read an article today that talked about the fact that God willing, one day we will no longer need to have Black History Month because it'll just be American history all year round. And I think, you know, those experiences I had bear that out. I mean, most people who I would speak to only knew Dr. King, not from the speech, the I Have a Dream speech, but the phrase was all they knew in totality about Dr. King. And so, you know, the point being, your documentary is incredibly important. You know, Selma has gone on to
Yeah.
be way more than I thought it would be in terms of illustrating the fact that Dr. King was a human being as opposed to just a saint, and contextualizing some of that struggle. So as much as I agree with you that it doesn't, some of that doesn't play philosophically, not knowing the historical minutiae is detrimental. And I've seen it in African countries as well,
Yeah.
whereby the through colonization, the indigenous history has been eroded, where people know more about David Livingstone than their own
Oh,
people. I literally had that in Botswana,
really?
where I did a film called A United Kingdom, and they didn't know about essentially the father of their nation, but they knew about David Livingstone. So there's a very insidious thing going on. Let me ask you one more question, Sam, before I go to some of these other questions. Was it just plain old jealousy with Hoover? It felt like it was personal with him. It felt, I can't tell whether Hoover just wanted the spotlight, and then there was this articulate leader of men and women who was galvanizing the country, galvanizing presidents' attentions, making them second guess themselves, forcing them to go from the Civil Rights Act to the Voting Rights Act within a year. You know, things that in his over 40 years as the leader of FBI, I'm sure he knew he was a power broker, but for a time, Dr. King was shifting culture in a way that he just couldn't. Is there an element just of the little man syndrome that was going on there?
Yeah, I think it was personal. I think it was personal. I think you're right. I think, look, J. Edgar Hoover had the longest tenure of any director of the FBI. And you know, and I know that he had a tremendous amount of power in his files. He could blackmail anybody. And then the idea that this one man, this minister from Montgomery, Alabama, you know, took the country by a storm, had to gall Hoover, had to absolutely gall him. And you're right, the fact that JFK, Bobby Kennedy, Lyndon Baines Johnson, would welcome this man to pay attention to him because they were concerned about the power he had to gall J. Edgar Hoover. It was personal. It absolutely was personal.
Wow.
You know.
Wow. Let me go to a question real quick. It says here, what do you think the danger is of us as a society putting social activists and leaders on pedestals? Is there any fundamental danger in that?
Well, here, I'm not sure there's a danger. I think the thing we need to remember, and I think you could speak to this also, that as much as powerful a leader as Dr. King was in the movement, that movement still would not have happened without the Diane Nashes, the James Bevels, the Andy Youngs, the Clarence Jones, the Fred Shuttlesworths, all those foot soldiers who supported, who helped Dr. King, Ralph Abernathy, I should say also. Basically, they were the foot soldiers who basically said, "We're with you, Dr. King, to keep this movement going." It wouldn't have happened without those people. And the people in the communities who came out there to march and to fight and to protest, like the folks in Selma, when he went into Selma, like the young people in Birmingham. Without these people committing themselves to his nonviolent activism, things would not have progressed. And the other thing that was very strategic that Dr. King knew, and I remember this from watching the film, he knew that by going into these southern cities, if he could get the national press, the national media, to get in to document what was happening, it would have an impact. Very smart, very strategic.
But where I do think the point is well made as to whether or not it is dangerous, because I remember when Selma came out, people kept on asking me, do I think we need another Dr. King? And at that point, I didn't really have an articulate answer, if I'm totally honest. But as the Black Lives Matter movement arose, it illustrated to me that there is a danger in having a figurehead, because when you have a figurehead, you can cut the head and there is a real chance that the body can die. And to a certain extent, the civil rights movement, as we knew it up until that point in '68, definitely faltered, if not indeed died a kind of death. And I think it's because he became so central to
Exactly. I agree.
To the civil rights movement. And so I think the Black Lives Matter movement is a refinement of that, because trust me, if there were figureheads or a figurehead to cut off, they would have tried.
Yeah, exactly. I agree. I completely agree with you.
Either a character assassination, maybe even, dare I say, a literal one, but they would certainly be under huge pressure and heat. And that is something that King dealt with, Malcolm X clearly dealt with, even the Kennedy brothers to a certain extent, the aligning of themselves with notions that served Black people, put a target on their back. And we have seen historically in this country that when you rise above the parapet in that way, especially if you're deemed to be flying in the face of the notion of what is America and American, like Colin Kaepernick, there is...
That's right. There's reprisals. There's definitely reprisals. You're absolutely right. I completely agree.
Yeah,
I completely agree.
Sacrifice you. Okay. Oh, this one's for me. For David, having played MLK in Selma a few years ago, what were some of the most shocking moments from this documentary, and how did it help you understand MLK better? Good question. I guess nothing shocked me because, I spent time with Andy Young. I spent time with a lot of the guys who walked that road with Dr. King. And so a lot of what you talk about, they knew. I think your film gives incredible articulation to it in a broader sense, because it uses the backdrop of American life at the time. Like I say, the thing that did not shock me, but really landed for me is the fact that it was illegal. It was illegal. They went after this guy. The communism thing didn't stick. So they in this obsession to assassinate his character, they went after this element of the infidelity. Let me ask you this though, as a jump off to that question, the infidelity. There is a part of me that wonders if that wasn't a part of Dr. King's character or weakness, I should say, what would Hoover have gone after? It feels like he would have tried, he would have kept on trying, but did Dr. King, by having that weakness, give Hoover low-hanging fruit?
I think he did. And I think that if it wasn't that, they would try to find something else that they could hang Dr. King on. Which leads me to a question for you.
Oh.
In the scene where you and Coretta or Carmen are listening to the audio tape, that's basically the same letter we have in our film.
Right.
So was it, so I said, did they have it as an audio tape? Or did you guys, create that, that it should be an audio tape?
Yeah, I can't remember if we created it. I can't remember, but I will say that, I was part of the development of that film with different directors, different permutations of it for 7 years. And like you, we had so many moments where we wrestled with putting it in at all, whether we should go full bore with it, how much we should pull back on it. And to my mind, Ava DuVernay, who constructed the scene that ended up in the film, did, I think, a masterful job of touching on it from a personal point of view and not making it sort of salacious or titillatory in any way, but to really see its effect on the marriage, to see it having the effect it was designed to have, which is to hollow this guy out from the inside. And I feel like your film did the same thing. There's this really great chapter in your film where you use wonderfully judiciously picked footage that you can feel the weight on Dr. King's shoulders. You can really feel that he is in public, but dealing with something. And whether it's just phenomenal editing, but certainly because you're in that mind space watching it. And that was the thing, one of the things I loved about playing that scene is Dr. King is celebrated as an orator. And in Selma, when he is confronted about the infidelity, is the one time that he is bereft of words.
That's right. When she asked him the question, "Do you love me?"
Yes.
And you didn't respond immediately, man. It was that pause. And I said, "Whoa, what's he going to..."
Yeah, it's heavy. It's heavy. It's heavy to be a human being when you are a living saint. You are being canonized by your people before your eyes, and you know that you're weak, and you know that there are people who want to see you pulled down. The pressure on this guy over those 13 years, incredible.
Yeah. Tremendous, really tremendous.
Just incredible. Let me just pick one at random here. It says, can you both talk about where we take the fight next in relation to white supremacism in the US and the UK? How we can use film and theater to decolonize the curriculum, for example? Wow, good question. What do you think?
Well, from my perspective, my challenge and my responsibility is the next films I tackle is to really always kind of decode what American history is. You think it is, but really showing you what American history really is, And so, every time I'm trying to do a film about our experience, that's part of my responsibility. It's part of my challenge, And to open up that window so people understand that this notion of American history, the way I was taught it, doesn't just, focus on what happened with white people. It's really much more layered and complicated. And you should be able to see it from all different perspectives. That's the challenge, And to really just, again, make America aware of its very complicated history. Challenge people to go back into books and to learn this history, because it's complicated, And if you understand the complexity of America, you may look at it differently. The other thing I would say in terms of answering this question is that the struggle will never stop. The struggle for fighting for your rights continues. You got to fight it in the courts. You got to fight in the streets with protests. It's never going to stop, because if we ever come to the belief that, you know, in terms of America, I don't know about the UK, in terms of America, white people will one day say, "Oh yeah, we understand. Everything will be a great kumbaya moment." You're fooling yourself. The world doesn't exist like that. We are already seeing now in the states governments how they are trying to tamp down on the voting rights issues for, you know, so that the next election, less people of color will have the ability to vote. That tells you that the fight never stops.
Yeah, I was reading about that just today. The thing that is so shocking is how barefaced it is now. You know, it's just completely out in the open. The notion that you are going to willfully make it more difficult for people to vote, I just simply don't understand how anyone is on board with that. Surely we want every American to vote. So anything you're doing, it's clearly something nefarious is going on there to be
Yeah,
trying
you
to.
and I want many Americans to vote, but other people feel like, no, we want to get Donald Trump reelected.
Well, that's a whole other thing. But I think, you know, I mean, just having played Dr. King in this very specific moment as it pertained to voting rights, and attaining that, and then watching how that act has been eroded and challenged and beaten up, and you know, it really illustrates, despite the fact that yes, he was a human, flawed person, but the transcendency of what they achieved in that moment in 1965. I think people don't really fully understand that to have the Civil Rights Act in 64 and then the Voting Rights Act in 65 was borderline an impossibility. It
That's
was
right.
like putting Everest on your back and deciding to climb another mountain. It was
That's
just
exactly right.
impossible, and they achieved it, which is why we really must fastidiously, guard that. It's funny, talking about the responsibility of film. One of the things that always used to really irk me when we were trying to get Selma off the ground, you know, we just, for 50 years, Dr. King had died, and there had been no film centering on him, as a character, as an icon, as a historical figure. The only American to have a holiday named after himself in the 20th century, and yet a J. Edgar Hoover movie existed before a
That's
film
right. Yeah,
about Dr. King,
that's
which
right. Clint Eastwood.
yeah, which says something in and of itself. Okay, let me give you one more of these. Let me see here. Okay, it says here, in 2020, Trevor Noah made a statement saying that society has broken its social contract on Black America. Would you care to expand on this truth?
Society has broken its social contract with America.
Mm,
I think that contract's been broken many times, man.
yeah.
Yeah, I think Trevor is sort of like, you know, no, man, it's been broken many times in the past 50, 100 years. It's not anything new. I mean,
Yeah.
and quite honestly, man, Trevor should know better from where he comes from.
Well, that actually brings me to a point that I wanted to make, because, you know, we've been talking about American history, but, you know, being a person of Nigerian descent, having lived in Nigeria for 7 years, I've worked in many African countries. I was born, I'm here in the UK at the moment, even though I live in America now, but, you know, and I lived most of my life here in the UK. What we are talking about, all these things thematically, whether it's to do with the denigration of the notion of Black excellence, in order to, in some ways, platform white supremacy, these are all things that in Trevor's country of South Africa absolutely was in play. You know, my country of heritage, Nigeria, that was colonized and is still continuing to be have its resources siphoned out of it on the basis of this colonization back in the day. You know, this transcends Americans' youthful history by comparison to
Yes, right.
where Black people started on the African continent. The attitudes held back then in Europe still held now. You know, this stuff is so baked in before the birth of America and has now bled into America and is now part of the rise of nationalism that we've seen in recent years across the world. And so I think that's the thing to bear in mind as well, historically speaking, is that you sort of need to bleed beyond the borders of America to also fully understand just how long this has been going on.
It's a history that's so deep and so rich, man. I've spent much time in South Africa. I've been to Senegal. I've been to, you know, the notion of colonization around the world is frightening.
Yeah.
You know, if you go back to King Leopold in the Congo, man,
Oh yeah.
what they were doing, I mean, it's frightening. It's the notion of that all of a sudden the white people around the world said, we can take control of these people's lives. We can control their lives. We can control their resources. And the fact that it's so deeply seated in many of us that we lose ourselves culturally, we lose ourselves ethnically. It's frightening, man. You know, that this world history has been so baked. You're right, it's so baked in. We've been so it's an amazing thing, man. You know, I used to, when I was a kid, man, I used to love those old British movies about the empire in India, you know, Gunga Din, Rise of Lancer, the Raj. And I would say, oh man, the British are fantastic. And then when I got to some sensibility, man, and some maturity, I said, oh my God, man, what craziness, man. It's like every place in the world. You're right, man. It's not just America.
Every place in the world. And I'm going to end on this, Sam, because we're being told to wrap up. I could talk to you all day. There's Gwen. Gwen, I have to ask one more question quickly.
Go ahead.
Because I having lived on 3 different continents, Africa, Europe, and which Britain has now broken off from, bad idea, and America, you know, living in America now, when people espouse the Second Amendment and the desire to hold on to guns and all this kind of stuff, it's very clear to me that that is born out of a fear that we as Black people one day are going to say, we know what you did. It was wrong, and we want retribution.
That's right.
I don't think we're going to do that, but I do think that what Hoover was doing, what our former president just did, and what the holding on to this notion of America is about is when it comes to the destruction and erosion and denigration and marginalization of Black people is somehow tied to this notion that we will one day say,
enough is enough. That's right. That's exactly right.
Where does that sit in your mind?
Well, I'm in complete sync with you. That's why they hold on to this notion of guns in the Second Amendment. That's exactly the fear. That's exactly, and the reality though is Black people won't do that because we don't do that.
No,
we don't do that. But white people say, well, we would do it.
Right. No one's ever put the button up on it like that for me.
We would do it.
Yeah, probably because of us. This weird. I think it's because there is and of course this isn't all white people we're talking about, but the people who hold the notion that they are better than, or who are beneficiaries of that mentality. That's where it comes from, is that exactly. I recognize how tightly I'm holding on to this for my identity. I know that I would rather kill you than give this to you. So I have to believe you will one day try to kill me to get it from me. And
That's
I
right.
think that's what that mentality is. But Gwen, you're
This is a
here.
great conversation.
Yeah, I could go for hours. Thank you so much for the opportunity. Your film is magnificent. I
Thank
wish
you,
I had
David.
had it as a resource when I was researching to play Dr. King. It is easily one of the most comprehensive insights into who he was that I've ever seen. And it's just a real privilege to get to speak to you about it. So
Thank you very much. Great talking to you also.